The smell of smoke still lingers in my memory, not the smell of something being consumed, but of something sacred being male. Here, Thessalon's. It's not peace. It's a muffled noise. The sound of life as I knew it being strangled by the 4 concrete walls. I feel the cold of this cell seep into my bones. A cold different from the one outside, for it is a cold of the soul, of complete loss. I am prisoner P443, the arsonist who saw the justice of the world turning to ashes upon his own name. The fire consumed the altar and the pulpit, enough to desecrate the place and give me a long sentence. That day, I was kneeling, trying to sweep the soot from the floor that had once been the altar. I remember the sergeant's dry voice, which sounded soir-reversible as the collapse of a brick wall on a secret garden. He didn't need any lectures. "We've got you on camera, girl, and chemical traces. The gas can in the trunk is just icing on the cake." I didn't cry. I couldn't give in to that bitter miracle of weakness. A betrayal was sealed. The headline was written before I could breathe. Pastor's daughter, arrested for burning down church. The circumstantial evidence combined with the trace to seal my guilt in the eyes of the law. Looking at the thin bars, I realized they protected me from a truth I couldn't bear. In church, I lived a lie, of faith perfect. In this prison, the brutality is sincere. What truly transforms me is the shadow of doubt. What if burning the altar was the only way for the truth behind the fire to come to light? I needed to burn the house to save the garden, but no one understands the symbolism of those flames. The worst was yet to come. My father would come to visit me, and I knew he would bring the envelope. The living room of the prison, it's a garden of sorrows, full of faded colors and stifled whispers. And yet, it was there that I waited for him. When my father entered, my body shrank. He wasn't wearing his cassock, but his gaze was the pulpit. There was no forgiveness. There, only the weight of years of preaching about sin and eternal fire. I was now the embodiment of failure, the black sheep who burned not only the altar, but also his life. The air smelled of bad coffee and strong disinfectant, futilely trying to cleanse what cannot be cleaned. The loss of dignity. "Why, Sarah? After all the faith that we invested in you." The words came quietly, without anger, which was infinitely worse. He wasn't yelling. He was mourning the end of his legacy. I tried to say, "Dad, I didn't do this," but the sentence stuck. For an instant, I saw a glimpse of that man who promised me there would always be redemption, but this glimpse was swallowed by the public figure. The pastor who only saw the betrayal. He didn't touch me. Instead, he pushed a crumpled envelope under the table. "This is for your lawyer. I can't anymore." I picked up the envelope, feeling the rough paper, and his action was what cut me the most. He could no longer be my father, just the minister of a hurting congregation. It was a silent rejection, a silence louder than any jail siren. At that moment, I understood that my true prison was not made of steel and concrete, but of disappointment and family honor. As he stood to leave, he said, staring into space, "Your mother prays for a miracle." The envelope, however, contained something besides money. A single old photograph, folded and nearly illegible, of the church before the renovation. It was the first clue, and I knew it wasn't an act of forgiveness, but an encrypted confession. I could barely breathe the air in the cell, not because of the musty smell, but because of the mist in that envelope. I felt dirty, condemned, and the object my father left behind felt like a lead weight. That envelope was the only bridge left between my life in prison and my old one-home. But he was giving me the bridge to burn. The crumpled paper of the photograph, which looked like it had been handled for years, smelled of mothballs and old carpet dust, the exact aroma of my father's office before he retired. What caught my attention wasn't the imposing white facade of our first church. It was the folded, almost torn corner, revealing a pupper hidden behind the facade's frame, just above the side door. I had to take a bar of soap and rub the photo discreetly to get a better look. It wasn't my mother's handwriting. The lines were stiff, cursive, and there was a symbol scratched into the edge, the drawing of a party at. That moment, I was startled. Silence. My father was telling me something, but he couldn't speak. He had to show me. The weight of my innocence, once crushing, turned into a cold urgency. This picture was my miracle, the loose end that fate threw me. She didn't give me freedom, but he gave me a mission. If my father couldn't offer it to me, forgiveness openly, he offered me the justice in secret. But why betrayal? Was this information being conveyed through such a subtle code? And what was in this side door that would merit secrecy and fire? I needed to find someone who could decipher these symbols, and the sound of a key turning in the cell door alerted me. It needed to act before Thalos was total. The prison cell is a maze of metal and noise, but the threat always comes in the form of silence sudden, a vacuum before the storm. I clutched the envelope to my chest, feeling the rough paper, the only thing that connected me to my old freedom. I could feel the other women's eyes burning into me. The phrase, "Gonna face it, newbie," wasn't a question, but a declaration of war. These were tough women who had transformed prison in your own home particular. I tried to look bigger than I was, but at 20 years, my body still has the shyness of someone who has just left home the pastor. I knew I needed to draw the line, or I would be swallowed up. The group leader stepped forward. "What is your name, young lady? And what is your crime in tarnishing our ward?" I looked at her directly. In a world where my name was synonymous with betrayal, the only way to begin my journey to redemption was affirming my identity. "I am Sarah Wilson," I replied, my voice slightly choked but firm. "And I'm here for arson." The name sounded like my verdict, harsh and final. The leader just laughed, the sound like metal barbs. "Tone it down or they'll knock you out," a voice growled from behind, changing the rules of the place. What happened next was an act of pure, desperate survival. I knew I needed justice, but not the systems, the one that would keep me alive. I let the envelope slide, and it fell with a thud to the floor. The photo of the intact church caused immediate confusion. As they stared, my eyes found the only figure who hadn't reacted, the older, quiet one, sitting in the corner, who seemed to have seen much more than just Thalos and freedom. She had her name scratched on her uniform, Rosa. My instinct told me to keep my distance, but desperation for justice pushed me forward. Rosa sat in the shadows, barely visible. Her name scratched into her uniform was the only thing distinguishing her from the concrete. She was embroidering something with red thread, the needle like a small dagger in her hand. She emanated a silence that was not of fear, but of authority. The air around him smelled of wilted lavender, as if he were trying to keep a garden that had long been forgotten. I approached, feeling Rosa's heavy gaze, which was as cold as the look my father had given me. I had to risk everything, sliding the photograph and envelope across the dusty floor, stopping them at her feet. "I need to know what this means," I whispered, fearing the pavilion leader would hear. Rosa didn't even blink, just continued her embroidery. After what seemed like hours, she finally looked up, and her eyes were two wells of loss. She didn't ask about my crime, nor about the church. She picked up the photo. Her wrinkled fingers traced the line of the facade, and finally touched the folded corner, where the symbol of party was drawn. She closed her fist over the photo and looked at me with a mixture of pity and scorn. "Secrets here have a price, pastor's girl. What's yours?" I felt the humiliation of my past crush my present. I had no money, no power. I only had my innocence and the need to redemption. I knew my only payment would be my time, a piece of my life. Rosa didn't ask for money or cigarettes. She wanted the story. I started at the beginning, talking about my life and home of the shepherd, of the faith-blind spot that was suffocating me, and the mothball smell of the envelope. When I got to the gas can in my car, she stopped me. Her gaze was intense, like someone who hadn't heard a crime, but redemption about to begin. "You're not here because of the fire, girl. You're here because of what the fire covered up." She picked up the old photograph and pointed to the small symbol of party scratched in the folded corner, just above the side door of the church. "This," she said, and her rough voice was like fine sand. "This is not a drawing. It's a paper warning your father is sending you. He didn't betray you, child. He marked you to protect you." She explained that long before it was a Reformed church, the building was used as a meeting place by a specific group. This group used the party as a symbol of something that needed to be purified. She told me a name I didn't know, but which carried the weight of an old justice not fulfilled. the brotherhood of the first light. The silence between us became a tunnel to the past of that home. My heart leaped, not with fear, but with cold hope of a possible miracle. I didn't burn down a church. I lit a match in the history of a congregation. Thalos was not in being guilty, but in having lived in the lie of betrayal. The worst thing, she whispered, was that the party, it was a code, and the proof I needed was linked to a man who died in here. Rosa finally said the name that silence and prison tried to delete for years. Elias. She repeated it, and the sound was like a crack in concrete. Elias was the caretaker, a good man, the true guardian of the old church building. He found the map first, a map to something hidden in the old foundation of the church. Home my father, who at the time was just rising through the ranks of the church, needed that secret. And to get it, he needed to get rid of Elijah. He's the one who planted the evidence of the robbery in Elias's locker, Rosa whispered, her voice shaking with loss. The crime that led Elias to prison was the first betrayal that cemented my father's pulpit. Elias didn't steal anything. He was silenced and died here, years later, without forgiveness or redemption. Rosa, Elias's sister, was there for him, looking for the justice that he never had. I was next, framed by fire to protect the secret. A betrayal Elias's and mine were two sides of the same dirty coin. It was then that Rosa gave me the most crucial clue about the map. The map is not made of paper, it is made of stone. A loose stone under the pulpit, where the new carpet was laid. Elijah used to say that the secret was in the house, but under the faith. I looked at the hole in the cell wall. The miracle it wasn't mine freedom was proof of Elias's innocence. I needed to act fast, and to do that, I needed the only person who could break into my father's office without arousing suspicion. My mother. Rosa's revelation gave me a dangerous dose of within the midst of despair. I wasn't an arsonist. I was a messenger, trapped in home wrong. But the silence was my enemy. How to ask my mother, a woman who lived in denial and betrayal, silent, to break into her husband's office and search for a secret that could destroy their lives? I couldn't call her and tell her the truth, not without putting her at risk and risking her thinking I'd lost my mind. I needed a miracle of communication. I remembered the old ones cards that my mother and I exchanged when I was in college. They weren't actual letters, but notes hidden in books that we exchanged. In these notes, we used our own language to talk about our fears about the church and my father. The code always involved the word garden, which for us meant his office, and seeds, which were the important documents. I felt the weight of the time on my shoulders. Every minute in prison it was a minute when the truth cooled, and the real culprit distanced himself from justice. I asked permission to write one paper, simple for my mother. The pencil trembled in my hands. I wrote about how much I missed taking care of our garden, and asked if she could water the old one's seeds. I subtly asked for the choir's hymn book where we hid our notes. I had to pray that even with the loss of her husband and her daughter's shame, my mother remembered the code. I looked at the clock on the wall and knew that the fate of my redemption was now in the hands of a woman who was suffering the worst pain, the judgment of her own home. Waiting here is the cruelest torture. Time already prison is a dense liquid that barely moves. After sending the paper for my mother, each day was a purgatory of uncertainty. Rosa, who watched me with assilence, almost maternal, said to me, "The faith is easier to burn than hope, girl. And your mother is burned with faith." Thelos, what we felt was different. Mine was freedom, hers was the perfect image that my father had built for her home. I was allowed to make a short call. When I heard my mother's voice, it sounded distant, as if from the other side of a grave. I tried to be casual, asking about the state of our garden. There was a long pause, a silence that pierced me. The pavilion's threat, "Lower your voice or they'll delete you," echoed in my mind. But the danger came from my own mother. I knew the line might be tapped, or maybe she was just shocked by my audacity. Finally, she whispered, her voice breaking, "I don't know if I can handle any more." Betrayal, Sarah. Oh, garden is dry. She didn't understand the code, or worse, she understood it and was refusing the call. My heart sank. That was the moment of truth. I had to beg for my miracle. I ignored the guard's warning that my time was ending. "Mom," I said softly, with all the raw emotion I had left, If you don't water these seeds, I will never have justice. The whole pulpit needs to come down. I hung up before she could respond, feeling the loss of a last resort. After the call, the tension in the cell block didn't come from the other inmates, but from the static air around me. I had bet everything on my mother and our secret code. Rosa watched me with a look that mixed contempt and strange approval. You broke the silence to save your freedom, girl. Here, that's like shouting the devil's name. She wasn't angry. She was warning me about the price of my boldness. I felt like I had opened a door of betrayal that could no longer close. My body in the cell was time waiting, but my mind was rummaging through the drawers of my father's office. That night, the cell light flickered, and one of the guards, who had never spoken to me before, stood in front of my bars. His eyes were not justice, but a warning. Your father came here today. He looked like a ghost. He said that if anything happens to the records, he will have nothing left to live for. He didn't say Minami, just the records. The threat was clear. My father knew I was after the truth, and was using the guard as a messenger. If he was innocent of the fire, he was guilty of something else. Something he was willing to protect more than my own. Redemption. I looked at Rosa, who was watching the scene from afar. That guard was proof that the loss was everywhere, even among those who were supposed to protect me. I needed a miracle double. That my mother acted, and that the secret of the map of Elias come to light before my trial ended my hope. The lawyer looked like a man tired of carrying the justice of the world, and the living room smelled of cold formality. The first thing he told me was the date. Your trial is set for 4 weeks from now. It's fast, Sarah. They want closure. The time accelerated suddenly. 4 weeks to unravel a family secret my father had hidden for years. The loss of mine freedom seemed inevitable. I tried to maintain my composure, but fear was a chill that radiated from my bones. I felt his gaze. He was a man of faith, and I was the condemned pastor's daughter, but he saw something in my eyes. A spark of redemption that didn't match my crime. He picked up a pen and dropped it on the floor. An awkward movement. When he picked it up, he handed me a piece of paper disguised as a legal note, with a crumpled corner. It was a paper of my mother. The scent of lavender was strong, the same as Rosa's. She had gotten the message. She had watered the seeds. The note was short, written in codes only the two of us knew. I found the seeds. They were in Priscilla's book of hymns. It's an old map, not a diary. It has a symbol of party and a name I've never heard, Elias. My miracle had arrived. My mother, who had previously retreated, was now my accomplice in the search for justice. The name Elias was the confirmation of Rosa's story, the missing link with the Brotherhood of the First Light. I looked at the lawyer, who was blinking in code. Now the real work was about to begin. The trial date, 4 weeks, was a sand clock turned upside down. I had a name, Elias, and a location, the hymn book, but the physical proof was still missing. The loose stone under the pulpit. I could no longer communicate with my mother, 4 cards coded. The time was scarce, and my father, the pastor, knew I was moving. I needed a desperate act, a miracle tactical. I looked at Rosa, who was watching my pale face. Loshers was mine redemption. I slid the piece of paper that my mother sent, with the name Elias scratched, to Rosa. She took it, and the fire in her eyes flared. Your father did this to my brother, and now he's doing it to you to protect that secret. He built the home of him on blood and betrayal. A justice. For her, it wasn't just seeing me free. It was seeing my father fall. I entrusted my last resort to her. You need to call her. Not me. You have to use your voice to force her to the pulpit. She will hear the betrayal in your voice, and you will remember the faith that we lost. The plan was risky. To use an unknown, harsh voice, the voice of prison, to scare my mother into freedom. Rosa nodded, her decision final. I do this for Elias. His it ends now, girl. But if she backs out, it's over. The air in the phone booth prison, it's always cold. But Rosa's act of using her own weekly call, her only contact with the world, was a warmth of redemption. She was sacrificing her own time to give me a chance to freedom. It was at Loshers in favor of my justice. I stood to the side, watching her. She was no longer as calm as someone embroidering. She was as tense as someone lighting a match. When my mother answered, She heard Rosa's strange, scratchy voice. "This is Rosa," Rosa began, and I knew my mother was about to hang up. "Your daughter is fine, but she needs you to water the garden in the right place, not the hymn book, but the place where the seeds of Elias were planted." The tone was not one of pleading, but of pure justice. Rosa was forcing my mother to face the betrayal that cemented the pulpit and the life of lies they lived in, home of the church. There was a long moment of silence. My mother, the woman who only knew faith on the surface, she was being confronted by a convict who knew the raw truth. "I don't know what you're talking about," my mother whispered, her voice weak, but Rosa cut her off with a sentence that was a punch. "Look for the loose stone under the new carpet, near the pulpit. Your husband doesn't burn down churches, he builds them on secrets. Now is the time to choose your freedom." Rosa hung up. I felt the guilt. I hadn't just forced my mother to act. I'd put her in danger. I knew it had worked when, a few hours after Rosa's call, the silence usual of prison was replaced by a restlessness in the guards. My mother was acting. The time was ending, and the trial was just days away. I cowered in my cell, feeling her fear and adrenaline. The loss of mine freedom seemed more and more like a necessary sacrifice for the justice of Elias. The action came through my lawyer, who showed up the next morning, pale and tired. He didn't break the news to me in the living room. He used the moment I was taken to the patio to whisper something urgent. "Your mother went to the office, Sarah. Your father picked her up. There was a terrible fight." She screamed that he had built the home of them about the betrayal and the ruin of Elijah. My father had finally stepped out of the shadows and revealed himself. He was a man desperate to protect his legacy, his false faith, and the secret buried under the pulpit. The big revelation came in the form of a single, dry, final sentence. "Your mother found the stone at the site of party stylized." But her father followed her. He took the object and threatened her, saying that he would bury it again in the garden of our first home, under the oak tree that he always said was proof of his faith. He's running away to rehide the evidence, and only a miracle would save him from going to prison. My father was looking for the same thing. Miracle the freedom, but for opposite purposes. The justice, it depended on my mother being faster. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and cold formality, a smell so opposite to smoke from prison. I was in the dock, watching my lawyer try, in vain, to build a defense of innocence. My father was there, in the center of the front row, looking like a martyr, his false faith intact for all to see. He knew that the time was against him, and the loss was imminent. The prosecutor was finishing his speech, painting me as the ungrateful daughter who committed the betrayal final against home of God. My mother entered the room hesitantly, and I felt a miracle of hope. She was alone. She didn't have the stone. My father had stolen it, but she had something better. She presented the lawyer with a paper-dented, an old one from my father to Elias, which she found hidden in the hymn book. My father looked at her with assailants threatening. The judge provisionally admitted the letter, over the prosecutor's vehement objection, and ordered an immediate forensic examination at the church. Hours later, under the pulpit's new carpet, the experts erected the loose stone, and they took out a metal tube with the map and old records signed by Elias. My father stood up, lost control, and shouted that he protected the faith. There was no more sermon that could fit in the silence that came. For the first time, the pulpit wasn't a stage. It was a test. When the judge's gavel fell, it didn't sound like a sentence, but like a tomb lid opening. I wasn't saved from the fire. I was illuminated by it. Justice had finally arrived, and the church burned from within. The word "not guilty" is the heaviest thing a human being can carry. When the judge banged the gavel, I didn't feel joy. I felt faint. Silence of the pavilion, which was once a threat, was now a promise. My lawyer looked at me with forgiveness and relief, and I knew that the battle for justice of Elias was over, but their redemption was just beginning. The smell of the street, of freedom. It wasn't flowers or rain. It was the smell of cars and hot asphalt. It was the loss of the family member. I had to lean against the car door, feeling the sun on my skin for the first time in months. My father was arrested in his own home, no garden which he swore was sacred, when trying to dig up the stone that had stolen. The news on TV was no longer about me. It was about betrayal hiss, The pulpit was in fact collapsed. My miracle, it was not liberation. It was faith in myself, but the prison left marks. I looked at my hand and wrist. I expected to see Rosa's red embroidery, but I only saw paleness. I needed to go see her. I needed to tell her that justice of his brother Elias had been fulfilled. But first, I needed to see my mother, the unlikely accomplice who, in the end, chose the truth over her husband. Get to Home Parish was like visiting a museum of my former life. The smell of ash and smoke was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. My mother was in the living room, sitting exactly where my father used to read his sermons. She no longer looked like the woman she'd faith-blind. She looked like a broken vase. The loss of it was visible. When we saw each other, there were no immediate screams or tears. There was a long, heavy silence. Finally, she stood up and gave me a hug. It wasn't a hug off forgiveness maternal, but a hug from complicity. "I'm so sorry, Sarah, for everything." I felt her fingertips, still smelling of earth. Perhaps from the garden where my father had tried to rebury her. Stone. She explained her initial retreat to me. I was scared. I was so afraid it was just another one of his fantasies, or that he was testing us. But when Rosa's voice told me about Elias and toe betrayal, I saw the party in my own heart. I am the real culprit. I closed my eyes to the justice of him for years, to maintain this home intact. I realized she didn't need my redemption. She needed hers. But where did she send hers? Paper, who framed my father? I needed to know how my mother acted so quickly in court, without having the stone in her hands. She took out a rusty metal box she kept under her mattress. It smelled of mothballs and old wood, the same smell I'd smelled from my father's envelope. She opened it. There was no money or jewelry, just cards and old photos. I knew he was hiding something in those drawers. "I found this," she said, handing me the letter she used in court. It wasn't just a letter from my father to Elias on the map. It was a disguised confession. In it, my father asked Elias to accept the blame for a minor theft in exchange for money, so that faith of the congregation would not be shaken. And the most shocking detail, the letter was addressed to Elias Wilson, the older brother of my father. The betrayal wasn't just a caretaker. It was a family member, a blood brother. That man in prison. He wasn't just the caretaker. He was my uncle, and Rosa was my aunt. A loss was overwhelming. My whole life in home, the pastor's story had been built on the lie that I was an only child, that the family was perfect. My father had framed his own brother to steal the secret of the map and build his redemption public. I picked up the pen from the box. It was an antique gold pen. He used this pen to write his sermons, my mother murmured. I looked at the pen. On the side, discreetly engraved, was a small party, the symbol of brotherhood of the first light. I was free, but I couldn't have freedom total until the redemption of Elias was complete. My first act as a free woman was to return to prison. The smell of disinfectant and the jingle of keys were familiar, but this time I wasn't the prisoner. I was the messenger of justice. Rosa was in the living room, embroidering with her usual red thread. She looked up, and there was no surprise, only a grim satisfaction. It took a while, pastor's girl. They won't let us go for miracles. But on paper, I took her hand, and the contact broke the silence that always surrounded us. I told him about the court, about the paper of my father, about yours, brother, Elias Wilson. I told you that the stone had been found, and that the police were now on the garden of our old home. Her eyes filled with tears. Not of sadness, but of a loss finally recognized. He will finally have forgiveness, she whispered, referring not to God's forgiveness, but to the forgiveness of injustice. Then I revealed the final secret. I slipped my father's golden pen, with the party carved, in front of her. My father didn't just betray the caretaker. He betrayed his own blood. You're not just Elias's sister. You're my tia Rosa. She looked at me, and the shock was overwhelming. The betrayal closed in a family cycle. But there, in that place of loss, the truth created a new bond of blood and justice. My freedom, it was a redemption her, but there was still one step left. I needed to understand what the map contained. I was free and with the justice, done. But the central mystery still lingered. Why my father risked everything, even his own freedom, for one secret that was hidden in the foundation of the home of the church. The answer was in stone, that the judge had ordered retrieved and analyzed. My lawyer brought it to me, wrapped in a velvet box, a strange object for a woman who had just come out of prison. A stone was not valuable in itself. It was a slate tablet, with a Latin inscription and an engraved map. Rose, my aunt, had told me that the Brotherhood of the First Light was a society of 19th century artisans and intellectuals who met in that building. They were not a sect, but a group that advocated a radical separation between religion and wealth. The map didn't lead to gold, but to a vault of documents. Records of land and property the Brotherhood owned before they were forced to donate everything to the church. Betrayal, my father's, was twofold. He not only framed his brother Elias, as he also planned to steal these lands, which were worth millions. The miracle and redemption, Elias's, was also a legal inheritance for the Wilson family, which my father tried to steal from Rosa and me. I looked at the stone, feeling the weight of faith that had been sold. The map engraved on the stone, it wasn't a lottery ticket. It was a check for millions, signed with the blood of Elias. A Brotherhood of the First Light had left behind an inheritance that my father tried to steal to support his pulpit of lies. My lawyer, amazed, told me that I was the direct heir of justice of Elias and the Brotherhood's assets. I was free and suddenly rich, but the money smelled of smoke. I looked at the stone of slate and felt the weight of betrayal. Using this fortune to build a new life would be the same as my father did. Build my freedom about the loss of my uncle. I sat on the silence of my new apartment, feeling the same oppression as prison. I had fought for redemption of Elias, not by a bank account. A faith in myself was put to the test. I had two options: disappear with the money and build my own garden private, or use it to honor the memory of Elias and combat the hypocrisy my father represented. The first option was the easier one. The second was the true one, justice. I knew that my first act with this money should be to free my Aunt Rosa and give her the freedom that my father stole from his family. Money was just a means, not an end, and I needed a plan for the next step. The process of freeing Rosa, my aunt, was quick. The Brotherhood's money was frozen, but my lawyer used the minimum necessary, and my father's confession about the betrayal Elias led the way. I was outside, waiting, smelling the freedom off her before he even saw her. The sound of keys, the iron gate opening. This time, the sound was of miracle. Rosa came out, and the sun seemed to hurt her eyes. She didn't look like the same woman who had embroidered in the shade, but rather like someone who had just emerged from a long grave. She hugged me. It was a hug of complicity and off-loss. The hug of two women from the same family who met in prison and recognized themselves in the justice. I took her to a quiet place. She told me that the other inmates, knowing of my innocence and betrayal of the pastor, they made assailants respectful in the ward. I told her about the fortune, about the millions in land and property my father tried to steal. Rosa showed no joy, only deep disbelief. We fought for redemption of Elias, not for money, girl. The freedom worth more than any wealth. I looked at her and knew that faith, hers, was purer than any sermon. My true mission now was to use this money to heal the community my father had hurt. The Brotherhood's money was a burden, but also a tool for justice. My father tried to rebury the secret of stone no garden of our old home, under the old oak tree. The first act of freedom. Aunt Rosa and I went there, not to get the money, but to get the peace. The smell of wet earth and thalos were overwhelming. We used the wealth for a symbolic act. We didn't rebuild the church. That would be honoring the pulpit from my father. Instead, we bought the empty lot where the church stood and turned it into a memory garden, dedicated to Elias Wilson. We planted hundreds of seeds, flowers, and a new oak tree, the symbol of a new faith that grows from honesty, not hypocrisy. Thessalonseat was different there. It wasn't oppressive like in prison, but meditative. Rosa smiled for the first time, and that miracle of joy was worth more than all the millions. The redemption of Elijah was complete. His name was no longer that of a thief, but that of a martyr. But there was something more. What party really meant to the living members of Brotherhood of the First Light. The memory garden was my new home, but I felt like a chapter was missing. The secret in stone and of the millions belonged to Brotherhood of the First Light. Aunt Rosa and I needed to find the moral heirs of that group, those who shared the faith already justice of Elias. The only clue I had was the symbol of party carved on my father's gold pen and on the old photo. My lawyer warned me that using the symbol publicly was dangerous. Betrayal. My father's actions had tarnished the name of the Brotherhood, but I had to take a chance. I placed a discreet ad in the local paper. Guardians of the Party, a redemption of Elias is complete. The memory garden has a message. I signed with the name Wilson, but I used the coat of arms of Party. The time. The wait was agonizing, for I knew I was exposing myself to a new kind of danger. One that did not come from prison, but from greed from outside. A week later, an elderly woman appeared in the garden. Not in fine church clothes, but with her hands full of soil, as if she were a gardener. She looked at the newly planted oak tree and whispered, "Thessalence is our vow, Sarah, but the miracle is the action." She was the granddaughter of one of the original founders of the Brotherhood. She came to tell me the true secret of stone. Why my father, and not Elijah, became the keeper of the records. The granddaughter of the founder of Brotherhood of the first lighter name was Abigail. She told me the story the stone could not. Elias, my uncle, had discovered the map of the land records, but he hesitated. The problem wasn't greed. It was faith. The Brotherhood feared that if the wealth were suddenly revealed, it would corrupt the new church, which was seen as a place of true redemption in the community. Abigail revealed to me that Elias was not only framed by my father, he allowed be framed. Your uncle believed that the justice for him it was less important than the protection and home. God, she whispered. He knew his father, the pastor, was ambitious, but he thought the secret would be safer with the man in pulpit than with Thessalence of an arrested janitor. Elias made an act of loss deep and personal for a greater cause. My father, the pastor, used this faith-blind brother to cement his betrayal. He promised Elijah that he would keep the secret, but instead, he used the pulpito build a personal empire, living a lie of miracle financial. The prison of Elijah was a sacrifice, and the church fire was my father's panic as he realized I was close to finding the truth. My freedom and fortune were the result of this sacrifice. I needed my father to know that his hypocrisy had not won. I asked to see my father in prison. The smell there was the same, but Thessalence, his was different. It was the silence of defeat. He was in his own cell, and prison seemed to have consumed every ounce of his fake faith. He looked at me, not with forgiveness, but with the cold rage of someone who has lost everything. The pulpit, the money and the freedom. You destroyed everything, Sarah, he whispered, his voice hoarse. The church, your mother, my redemption. I didn't let him finish. I needed him to know the truth of the matter, loss that he caused. You haven't lost their redemption, Father. You sold her when you framed your brother Elias. He trusted you to protect the secret of stone. And you betrayed him. I threw the golden pen, with the symbol of party carved on the table between us. This was not a symbol of faith. It was a symbol of betrayal. He picked up the pen, and his eyes fixed on the party. The miracle, what he sought, was not my guilt. It was his impunity. I confronted him with Elijah's sacrifice. Elijah accepted Thelos to save the community, and you used the home of God to steal millions. The justice did not free me. It imprisoned him. I stood up. I was no longer the daughter in the shadows. Their redemption his was impossible. But mine, finally, was real. With my father finally in prison, and to justice accomplished, Aunt Rosa and I were able to focus on what really mattered. The future. Home parish, which was the stage for betrayal, could no longer be a symbol of lies. We use a part of the heritage of Elias to restore it, not as a church, but as a community center dedicated to transparency and support for former inmates. Rosa, my aunt, became the director of the center. She used the knowledge she acquired in prison to help other women find their redemption. A faith was no longer in the pulpit, but in practical work, and in forgiveness mutual. The memory garden, where we planted the new oak, was the heart of the center, a living reminder that truth can grow even from loss more bitter. I looked at Rosa, whose hands now planted seeds, not embroidered threats. Thessalence of the community was no longer one of judgment, but of admiration. The miracle era is, a prison had brought us together and given us a freedom greater than any fortune. I still had the map of stone, but the royal treasure was the legacy of Elias, who was now returning to the community my father had tried to rob. After the dust settled and the community center Elias was working, I felt the need to retreat. My face was in every newspaper. I was the pastor's daughter, the exonerated arsonist, the heir to the justice. Mass Freedom Reel wasn't fame, it was anonymity. I left Aunt Rosé in front of the center, taking care of the garden and wounded souls. I found a small apartment, with no views of the pulpit or to the bars. For the first time, Thessalincet was not a sign of threat in prison, but a luxury. I sat down, and finally began to process Thalos, not just from my old life, but from my faith naive. I realized that the prison had prepared me for life outside. There, I had to learn to decode the silence, to trust instincts and seek the truth behind the betrayal. I took the stone of slate, the map of Elias, and I placed it in a simple frame on the wall. It was my miracle. Proof that their redemption, it doesn't come on your knees, but through struggle. I hadn't yet found peace, but I had found my purpose. I knew my healing journey would involve writing the whole story, putting the truth on paper, a paper to the world that never knew what happened in my garden. The time healing, but memory requires work. I sat down in front of a notebook, feeling the weight of the pen in my hand. Not the gold pen with the symbol of party, that one stayed in the center of Tia Rosa, like a trophy of justice, but a simple ballpoint pen. Beginning to write was the final act of freedom, the last barrier between me and the prison. I needed to expose each betrayal, each loss, every piece of silence that suffocated me. The first paragraph was the hardest, a struggle against the fear of reliving the pain. I began with the smell of smoke, the sergeant's voice, my father's gaze in the courtroom. I wasn't writing a diary. I was forging my own. Redemption on paper, using the structure of a confessional statement. I needed the sentences to sound like their reflections on life that suffering taught me. I looked at the stone of Elias in the wall, and she gave me the faith to continue. I could no longer lie about my home, about my past. The justice to Elias, and my own freedom would not be complete until the world heard the truth of the shepherd's daughter who found her miracle and your freedom within the bars. I knew that by the time I was done, I would have turned my father's hypocrisy into apaparope honesty. I finished writing. The notebook was full, and I felt a deep tiredness, but also a lightness that freedom and prison never gave me. Each loss, each betrayal, every moment of silence had become a testimony of justice. I had in my hands more than proof of the innocence of Elias. I had proof of my own soul. The time what I went through in the cell was the time that I needed to find myself. The miracle final was not my judgment. It was the understanding that the faith is not built on a pulpit, beautiful, or the honor of a home perfect, but about brutal honesty. I looked at the garden through the window, thinking about Aunt Rosa, taking care of the seeds of Elias and souls in redemption. I knew that my father, the pastor, would spend the rest of his life in prison, and his would be a silence final and deserved. My path was different. I couldn't keep that paper just for me. I needed to share it, turning the pain into a lantern for others. My story, that of the pastor's daughter who set her own life on fire to save the truth, would be my last and most important reflection on life, and I wanted it to be told in the first person, in a way confessional and intimate, exactly as I experienced it.
What an intense day to Sarah Wilson. It's hard to imagine the weight she carried when she was accused of a crime to protect her betrayal of his own father and the redemption of his uncle Elias. Sarah's story teaches us that the loss of something we consider safe, like home or faith, may be paradoxically the key to our freedom and our redemption. I want you to reflect. If Sarah, arrested and condemned, could find the justice under Apple Pit, where do you need to look to find yours? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I promise we read every single one. If you enjoyed the way we told Sarah's story, and if your heart was touched by this miracle of forgiveness and truth, help us to continue. Click the subscribe button and join our community. Your support is what allows us to share more real voices, like Sarah's, who have turned pain into purpose.